Frank Zosa. Who am I with? River West Neighborhood Association.
Renee Brooke, planning manager for the city.
Holly Hardy Planning Department.
Jeff Harris, Solar Home Builders. Counselor Perkins will be here shortly. And on the internet, we have Brett Hewitt, Arborist Committee Member. Is that sufficient?
That's definitely. No, that's the main.
Okay. We all set? I mean, Christie will be here shortly, so. Okay, that's the roll call. The next step is, we'll do the declaration of actual or potential conflicts. Remember, this is the thing where it's safer to disclose it than it is to not, even if it's not likely to be an actual conflict in the future. There may be a discussion later on of a community for which I am the vertical contractor, not the land developer, but the vertical contractor on how the trees came through that process. So that would be one I felt like disclosing, I guess.
No conflicts.
I represent builders in the region who are likely to be impacted by whatever we propose in city council.
I'm an architect, but I don't have any work currently, and so I don't believe I have a conflict.
I work for Sarah Architects. We have projects in Portland and Bend. Currently, we're working on the box factory. None.
No conflicts.
Yeah, potential conflict.
Potential conflict, yes, as a developer.
Not sure, so potentially, however, BCRD has an interest in protecting trees.
As a consulting arborist, I do have potential conflict.
As my day job as an affordable housing developer, I have a potential conflict.
Don't believe I have a potential conflict.
Okay, let's see. The next slide that where we are on. Okay, so we're well, let's go to the next slide where we're talking about, okay, we're really here on item 3 for our 5-part direction from council, which is preservation standards for larger trees. The language was similar to the Southeast Area Plan, which has guided us so far into the discussion about regulated trees at potentially 6 and 10 inches. And then also what is a priority tree? I'm still getting the language right. The priority tree. And our discussion last time centered around evaluating whether that threshold for priority tree was set at 24 inches where it currently is in the code in the Southeast Area Plan, or 20 inches. And perhaps the intended or unintended consequences of the difference between those two. So Pauline's prepared some analysis of existing land use applications so where you can see the sizes of the trees color coded to give us something to look at, a little bit of a visual.
And just to touch on number 1, I've been working on that. So we are going to provide consistency between different documents in the Bend code, the standards and specs in the Bend development code. So that's my goal to provide that. And then the clear and objective standards as we start drafting the standards, I will make sure that they're clear and objective. But by stating that for example, a priority tree is 20 inches, we've already established a very clear and objective standard. And then number 3, as Jeff was saying, is our scope for today, and that is coming to consensus or majority vote on preserving standards for larger trees and what is a larger tree.
That way, because immediately as soon as we have those 2 recommendations as solidified as we're comfortable with, and we move into some options for preservation of a sum of DBH to replace trees that are not able to be saved as part of the development application, which then moves us immediately into other mitigation techniques, tree replacement or fee in lieu. And so I've found myself at least getting wrapped around the axle a couple of times of trying to find the perfect inch DBH when the reality is that number matters, but then so does the next step, which follows to the next step. So we'll move through those. I think we'll gain some momentum after assuming we can agree on some numbers today as part of those big rocks into the jar first for our recommendation to council.
Do you want me to take this one?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
So this is where we started off last week and ended, and we talked about regulating the tree size requirement for inventory mapping. So as Jeff said, this is just the very beginning. We need to set a standard so we know when a developer submits an application, what is their inventory going to have to include? It's not saying they have to preserve all these trees, it's just saying what does the inventory have to include? And so last week, there was the discussion of the current bend development code, which is deciduous trees is 6 inches and then coniferous trees is 10 inches, no matter what kind. And then there was discussion on junipers last week, and I believe it was Eric that suggested maybe we still use the 6 inches for deciduous trees and then 12 inches for the coniferous, and then back down to 10 inches for all other coniferous. So these are the two options that we heard discussed in the majority last week. And if we could possibly get to a vote on this and then move on to discussing the size for a priority tree, that is the goal. And I did take a picture. This is outside my house, and it shows a juniper and a pine in the parkway strip. Similar size too. Yes.
I was curious if we'll have an opportunity for discussion. Jim was not at the last meeting, asked to provide some additional thoughts since he didn't get a chance to speak last time, which I'm of course happy to do. I was thinking, is there a gut feeling around the table as far as, you know, the 6 and 10, not agnostic as far as species, or the 6, 10, and 12 conversation? Are there strong feelings among the group on a need to carve out junipers in a particular way?
And one thing to remember, this is mapping. So if we raise the bar on the size of a juniper, that means less junipers will be preserved. Potentially, depending on what percentage of trees we talk about in the end being required to be preserved or mitigated for.
Could I just ask a quick question? Where did the 12 inches come from? Why was that not?
Eric, I believe at the last meeting, just.
I brought that number up. I suggested that number.
There were several others as you went around the room that said, oh, this idea of mapping or setting a different standard for junipers was interesting, but we didn't get a strong.
But it's not based on how fast they grow or anything, it's to
Just the number.
I spoke with Brett after the first meeting, and we had an interesting conversation because it was pretty obvious that my original opinion about Western juniper is that I'm negative about it. I think Karen expressed the same at the last meeting, and Brett, and then Chris also. Should I move the mic because I'm getting an echo? Or redirect it? Yeah, maybe better.
Is there a microphone or
Yeah.
a speaker over there?
Is that a speaker in the corner there?
It's a powerful voice.
Jim needs no mic.
Chris brought this up as well. The tree is considered invasive in some respects. Ben's history was one of clear cutting. Most of the trees on the west side were removed in the past 100 years. That was a man-made process that allowed juniper to move into the west side. I would suggest that juniper, I've changed my opinion. It's invasive in the sense that it has this tenacity to take root and become a tree almost anywhere. That conversation led to a conversation that I had with some friends who work for the Forest Service, and I don't want to depress everybody, but their climate models all suggest that in the next 30 years, there won't be any trees here anymore, except juniper. And even the juniper may not survive. Isn't that a lovely thought? So the areas where Western juniper have been prevalent, the southwestern United States, the high mountain deserts, those trees are starting to die, not because of water, but because of heat. My concern is if we start saying that a juniper has to be a certain size, on the east side of the city, as you pointed out, they're pretty much the only trees that will grow there, right? And a 12-inch juniper tree over there could be very old. And a 12-inch juniper tree at COCC could be 50 years old and in the way. And I guess where I'm going is we ought to be thinking on the east side of preserving as many junipers as we can. And on the west side, not worrying about it and looking at canopy. Now, I'm not saying that it needs to be so complex that we divide it up, but is there a way that we can take a look at if there's a predominant species in the tract or the only species in the tract, and it gets a different look?
You know, I've been thinking about this too, Jim, like, I also trended a little negative on juniper, but as I'm trying to think about this, you know, does it really make sense to have a whole carve out size wise when our assignment is large trees?
Right.
And if large is 10 for this, I mean, we have the benefit of saying 6 inches is important for deciduous in this climate, and 10 is the current number in the code for coniferous. I'm not sensing this like groundswell of feeling among the committee here that we must do something different with juniper. I think it's a useful discussion, but I would love to hear if I'm gauging that wrong, but I'm getting a whole lot of ambivalence toward whether or not it's really matters that much. You know, the juice for the squeeze is probably just at the diameter, at least as far as this group's feelings are. Christy.
Yeah, and I think like if we're talking to right now about just the bottom number, trees to be regulated, it's just for counting and mapping, it's just for the inventory. So it doesn't mean that on the west side, you have to keep any of those 12-inch junipers. So
Right.
I think that's like important to remember too, like this doesn't mean you have to keep them.
Yeah, we're not up to our ears in 11-inch junipers.
Yeah.
And there's a secret effort to get rid of the 10 to 11-inch junipers or anything. It was the critical thinking is part of our task here, right? We're in a recommending body. Whatever the decision is going to be will be made by council anyway, right? But we want to give them, we're doing our best work here in the lead up to this.
Yeah, and keeping it simple too.
Yeah.
6 and 10. You know, so the idea is to keep the code simple. If we want to start splitting hairs on east side or west side, we can do that once you know what's out there.
One example that we're gonna go through, that's on the northwest side of Washington and Shetland, I believe it is. That had 48 junipers and 12 ponderosas. So, you know, it varies all
Right.
over.
And we could assume that what's in the code, the 6 and 10 right now is what we continue to assume would apply going forward. And then you may see after Pauline gets through the rest of her slides and we start talking about what needs to be preserved. You may circle back and then think about, okay, what's showing up on this map that needs to be preserved?
Yeah.
Because that's,
Yeah, I think
we're trying to think about
we
that.
need this to be able to get to the next
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
So,
Is not most of the development that's going to be happening over the next 20 years going to be on the east side?
The majority of it,
minute wise.
the north and east
Right.
and southeast,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, southeast, I mean, certainly the thumb and all of that,
Mhm.
but, and there's going to be Pondo there. But I'm just wondering, I love the plug and play that you said at the first meeting. And it was repeated often in the second meeting, that it has to be adaptable, that we have to create something that if it isn't working 5 years from now, or even 2 years from now,
Yeah.
we can change it.
Absolutely, but if we don't get something put in there, we've preserved 0 trees in the meantime, so.
Yeah.
Could we do then, there's a couple of comments, so I'm gonna push this to a show of hands shortly, so. Sarah, Chris was trying to raise his hand a minute ago, if that's okay, so I'll start with Chris and then.
Yeah, and one thing I want to, and I think it was a recommendation of mine last week, is I think the 6-inch should be kind of across the board. I'm not sure if there should be a difference between deciduous and a coniferous tree. We took a look at a bunch of tree regulations last meeting. And if you guys notice, I don't think any of those, at least I can think of off the top of my head, had a difference at what most cities will call significant tree, which is basically that tree that needs to show up on the inventory. Most cities have that 6 inches as that significant tree. There's no species qualifier. Just some quick back of and Brett, you can back me up on this to let me know if you agree, but for my back of the envelope math, generally it takes for like a ponderosa pine about 8 years for 1 inch in diameter. And so we're looking at about like a 40-year-old tree that's a 10-inch tree, just to kind of put things in perspective. So 3 inches, that's 24-year-old tree is what a ponderosa pine will be. And the majority of the trees that we're going to find, especially in these developed areas, as Jim pointed out, are going to be conifers. The only time you're ever going to see deciduous trees if you're, essentially, I'm not sure if it would be an effective thing on the development code. Maybe if you're buying an old homestead, maybe a farm, and you might find some apple trees. But for the most part, if you're developing new land, you're going to find all conifers. And so now you're saying essentially that number is 10 inches in those cases. So my recommendation is to just drop the conifer deciduous difference and just go on to 6 inches.
A lot of trees that we plant on year one are 4 to 5 foot tall conifer trees, and they're 6 inches to start with. And so I don't know that I quite follow, because I've got pine trees. I live in the Northeast. I've planted pine trees. They've been up 3 years. They're doing great. And they're probably 8 inches already. So I don't know. I just shrinking it back down doesn't make sense to me.
I'm not sure, I guess the challenge there.
Well, our objective here is to like save some old growth and some bigger trees.
Mhm.
And it seems like we're going backwards here in terms of lowering it from 10 inches down to 6 inches.
I think you're correct. This does nothing to preserve large trees. I think if anything, this gives developers some more leeway, if anything, because if we're allowing options to save X amount of trees, this will actually give developers more options, because instead of having only 10 inches and above, which is probably going to be a smaller number, now you have more trees to work with when you're working towards meeting some of these goals that we might be proposing. So that might be one way to look at it. But you're right, if we're just talking about, but I think we're not quite getting the mitigation step, but you're right. I think mitigating is that next big thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I think the concern would be that you go in for an application and your map now shows twice as many trees.
Right.
And now it looks like you're trying to take out
That's
2 times as many trees.
right.
So anyway, that's a great point, but that would be my concern. Right?
A lot of 7-inch junipers on your map now, so.
Yeah, and I think and one of the things that we're missing here too is that I think condition of the trees can also be another thing. So a lot of times those tightly grown rows might not be suitable for retention. And so I think
Which is, I think, another reason why you might not want to inventory all those little trees.
Little, meaning.
7-inch, 8-inch trees.
On the juniper.
Yeah, I would disagree. So we've got 2 sites right now that we just have inventoried, and we didn't inventory them, like if the surveyor went out and picked them up, and I think they picked up everything 6 inches and larger. I think that's just what they do, and there are a bunch that are not in groves, and they're healthy and they'll stay and they'll grow. And I think those trees that are only 6 inches in diameter, they've had however much time they've had to establish, on an undeveloped site. And so they'll probably be hardier than, the new ones. It's actually like the survival rate of pondos transplanted is not good. So preserving the ones that are already established, I think is pretty valuable. So, I think just to get the survey is reasonable, but, Eric's point and Corey's point is true. Like if you've got those small ones in a grove, they're not going to survive and they're not worth saving. And so I don't know if there's a way to say like the inventory is 6 inches unless they're like, less than 12 inches apart. 12 inches apart. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. And I was thinking about this before as I was looking through, I was reading through Karen's report. 2 of the sites have significant topography, and we still have to comply with the Central Oregon Storm Manual in the end to retain the water on the site of each individual lot after a site's developed. And so that's where you end up with a bunch of flat pads. And if there were trees between them, they couldn't be saved anyway, because you're required to have a bowl on every lot. And whether or not that makes sense, we just don't have a storm system for it. So it's like, it's not just a decision to remove as much as the practical reality of the densities required by the goal of the next UGB expansion and the other competing factors more so than just saying we want to get rid of a 4-inch or a 6-inch. So it's the inventory number matters, but it matters more the numbers that we pick for the preservation level. I want to go back to Sarah, and then Kavi's next.
I'm just wondering how, like, for the options for consideration, the options are all like, and at least X% of the total tree diameter on site. So I assume the total tree diameter would only include what's mapped.
Correct.
So if it's a smaller number across the board or just generally, and we go, even at the lowest option of 20%, that total tree diameter is increased. So ultimately we end up preserving more trees.
That's one way of looking at it.
Kavi, you had your hand up as we were going around.
I think this is maybe taking a step back, but I just want to make sure I understand correctly. So we're just talking about which trees would be inventoried in general. And so currently the code is that split between deciduous and coniferous. And I'm guessing the reasoning we don't inventory every tree is that logistical cost, or there's less benefit to inventorying every tree.
It's a good question. The why behind where it is.
Maybe all those reasons, I'm not sure.
Probably about
So is it just that there's less value?
assumption.
Yeah.
So there's higher cost to the benefit of doing that for less than a certain size.
Yeah, that's a reasonable take on it.
Okay, and if I understood Chris correctly, he was mentioning some other cities are just have the 6-inch, they don't have the.
And well, I think we took a look at the street codes from last week. And if you, again, I would point out that the majority of cities out there have just a single significant tree size, and it is 6 inches. And that's pretty much across the board.
And would it be, sorry, one more question then, would it be fair that for any inventory, they would still have sizing as well? So you would still be able to have a number for everything bigger than 10 versus everything bigger than 6. You just have more information if you did inventory like that.
Yeah, I think where it comes down to it is in these percentages of preservation or the total diameter at breast height of trees preserved in lieu of the priority trees that couldn't be saved. So that's part where it's like, it does, on the one hand, add more DBH to choose from in lieu. It also it raises the floor of the effort it takes to inventory a site. And that's not really a knowable number. Like it changes something, but it totally depends on how many trees are on the site and who's doing the survey and how much they're mobilizing, for survey equipment or having an arborist on site for that.
Sorry, last follow-up question of that. So theoretically, if I understand correctly, that's something that would still need to be considered as how that affects the total DBH or the total diameter available for that inventory. But right now, inventories don't count trees below 10 inches for coniferous at all.
Correct.
But you could still, if you wanted to, if you don't want to have that impact, you could still look at the inventory size for trees greater than 10 inches. To still keep that consistent if you wanted to, but you still have additional information on trees.
As far as
between
like
6 and 10.
the option, I'm not sure.
So today, they have to only map 6 inches or larger for deciduous, 10 inches or larger for coniferous. Obviously, our code's very weak, and that's why we're not seeing a lot of preservation.
Yeah.
If it was stronger, they would only have to preserve the trees that were 6 inches or 10 inches larger, depending on the type of tree that was. They're not required to preserve the smaller ones. So if we reduce everything to 6, that's a starting point. We can always come back to it, as Renee said. But when we get to the next discussion, well, the one after that, when we talk about what is the preservation standard, it could mean more trees have to be saved because we have more trees that are inventoried. So if we say, for example, 25% of the site has to DBH has to be preserved. Well, 25% grew because now we're including way more trees in the inventory.
The denominator got a lot bigger.
No, I understand. I think my point was just that it doesn't hurt to have the inventory of more trees, even if we only apply it to trees greater than 10 inches. Unless there's some downside that I'm missing by doing that, if there's too much of a cost to do the inventory in the first place.
I would say cost for developers
Yeah.
inventory, trees that aren't required to be saved.
Could there
Also
be a-
studies product development a little bit in terms of, where you can put your buildings. If you have to work around a lot more trees, it makes it much more difficult. And this is just a stab in the dark, but I think for quite a long time, Bend was a very development friendly city. And I think we're in, from what I've seen out from the public comments, is that there's a pushback against some of that. They want to slow down some of that and retain more trees because they're worried about too many trees are getting removed. I think that's part of the reason why this committee is, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I don't know that current times would imply that it's been development friendly.
I just want to say, all I do is subdivision work in multifamily and over 30 years, and every single project I've done has had to have an arborist report, and they all use 6 inches. It's not a differentiation between 6 and 10, and it's just sort of standard to go out there and do it. I don't think, I mean, it's almost more confusing for an arborist to go out and say, oh, no, I know this one's 10, yeah. I'm not saying it should be 6. I'm just saying my experience generally has been, it's just been 6 inches. I just wanted to back up Chris on that.
Okay. Thank you.
I think,
Oh, okay, yeah,
I don't know if Dan.
tie onto that, or, oh, I'm sorry, you're right, Dan.
Yeah, sometimes on these, it varies per city, as Chris said, like the city of Vancouver, Washington, they're a little bit higher. They're at, I think, 12%. But then out of that 12%, they require 40% of those to be saved. So if you're going down to a lower number, like 6 inches, you could lower your percentage. So the first decision is, what's the size? And then we can craft the code from there. So I think this decision is a way, we have a way to manipulate and think about how we manage that number now, but information is good. And ultimately what we want to do is give folks flexibility when they're working through a site. So the more information we have, the more flexibility it seems like there's potential for.
Without 14 options. To try to
Yeah, right.
Much extra pages.
Right. But I think we're going to make, we could make that percentage decision after we make
Okay, so in the interest of moving forward, because we have to talk about the priority trees next.
Yeah.
Could we go around the room and I'm gonna offer up 6 and 6 or 6 and 10 as the options for you to vote on, and let's see where let's do a straw poll here and see where we land. I've got 2 columns written and I'm ready to we'll go clockwise. Gina,
6 across the board.
Chris,
6 across the board.
I figured I had a feeling. Karen,
I vote with Chris.
Sarah, thank you for your time.
Yes, we can be here.
Corey,
6 and 10.
6 and 10. 6 and 10.
6 and 6.
6 and 6.
6 and 6.
6, but I'm with Chris. Get rid of the deciduous. Just make it all 6.
6 and 6.
Just 6 across the board.
6 and 10.
Thank you also for being here. I'm gonna vote 6 and 10 because I'm feeling sorry for the 6 and 10 group.
Brett.
Oh, Brett.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. 6 and 6, please.
Alrighty.
And also, if I can help Brett out, I don't think he commented on the conflicts thing either. At the beginning.
Chris, Brett, would you like to enter any potential or actual conflicts?
Yeah, as a working arborist, there's potential for conflict. Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, great, buddy.
Thank you. Okay, so our group is voting to eliminate the species. What's the right genus?
Group, I guess.
We're not, so
Further up
it's
the-
essentially removing coniferous versus deciduous.
Yes, gymnosperms and angiosperms. So gymnosperms.
No.
Stop. Those are hard enough. Tamaracks.
Exactly.
Right?
Okay,
Yeah.
so And then for the thousands of folks viewing at home, this will all get boiled into something on which we will have further discussion and public comment.
Yeah.
So this is the fun part for Pauline, is to put this into words in some way that we can then review it against needed housing, fair and clear and objective, and our rules, or sorry, our assignment from council. Okay, so moving next into on the agenda here, so let's see. I think Ian's gonna give us 90 seconds on.
Maybe 2 minutes.
Okay,
But only.
I'll yield.
Yeah, everybody, Ian Whiteheiser, City Attorney's Office. I do want to say one thing before I jump into needed housing. So the comment, I think, from Chris, that there's a perception maybe across the community that development is easy in Bend. Here's my take. I think for people who are not involved very much in land use or development, but see it, they tend to think it's super easy or must be. People who are involved in land use and development and do it, many of them think differently. So with a lot of things, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. So I just want to caution, if you hear somebody say it's impossible to develop in Bend, or it's a nightmare, don't take that to the bank. And if you hear somebody say development is rampant and out of control and must be therefore too easy in Bend, don't take that to the bank either. So we're working in the middle, which frankly I think is probably where we should be, and that's kind of where the truth is. So needed housing, really quick. This is really convenient because when the council adopted the resolution that formed this committee, there's a finding in there on what is called Oregon's needed housing statute. And what that says, or what that does, is it requires that any standards, conditions, or procedures, and here we're talking probably about standards. If we're talking about amending our code to set new standards for residential development, those standards that regulate the development of housing, and now that means all housing, they have to be clear and objective. And we've talked about that before, and there has been a fair amount of litigation and case law that tells us what that means. So I think we generally have an understanding of what it means for a standard to be clear and objective. The statute also requires that those standards, conditions, and procedures can't have the effect, and I'm mostly reading from the statute and the resolution, either in themselves, individually, or cumulatively, of discouraging needed housing through unreasonable cost or delay. And that is an aspect of the needed housing statute where we really don't have a lot of guidance. There aren't a lot of cases out there telling cities or developers or community members what it means to discourage needed housing through unreasonable cost or delay. I will tell you that I think more and more people, including the Department of Land Conservation and Development and the Land Conservation and Development Commission, and some people who do development, are getting more and more interested in finding out what that means. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, one, this is state law. Two, people are getting interested in finding out what this means, and we don't have a lot of guidance. And three, not only did the council include that finding in the resolution creating this committee, the council also said that whatever this group comes up with, it shouldn't impede the development of housing. So this is all for you. I think this was a good time to sort of remind everyone, and that's why we're talking about this. As you get into the substantive work, you may be talking about recommendations to council that somebody may say are going to increase the cost of housing. And I'm not here to tell you that's not okay. But what I'm telling you, and really, I think what I'm asking the people in the development community who are on this committee to feel free to speak up about is, if you see something coming, if the group is discussing, again, recommendations to council that you and your expertise might start drifting towards whatever unreasonable cost or delay is, whatever, if you start seeing standards or people coalescing around standards that might cause unreasonable delay or unreasonable additional cost to housing, whatever that means, because we don't have a lot of guidance. I mean, my encouragement to all of you is feel free to speak up, because I think the council is going to want to hear that. So this is also not, don't take this as discouragement to the, I'll say the 6 and 6 crowd or the just 6 crowd. This is not discouragement to push for better, stronger tree preservation standards, even those that might increase cost or arguably increase the cost of development of housing, because I think, you know, we don't have anything telling us that we can't do that, but there's a balance here. And so now that you're moving into the substance, I just want to remind everybody to think of that, because I think the last thing we want to end up with is something that discourages more housing. You know, this may add cost. Some developers may make frowny faces. That doesn't mean it's illegal, but these are balances that we need to keep in mind as we try to come up with a better way to preserve trees. Make sense?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Since we don't have the definition for unreasonable and there's no case law, et cetera, and developers do speak up to let us know that might be like add to cost or the needed housing supply. Are we looking for the why to kind of provide data on why that would be an issue or?
Yeah, I'm speculating a little bit. The statute doesn't say that you can't have standards that somebody might say add cost to housing. Now, to me, is something unreasonable? Is there a case to be made that a standard that arguably adds cost to housing is unreasonable if it's not backed up by good findings or a good policy basis? Yes, I think that makes a standard more vulnerable and more likely to be found unreasonable if the committee recommending that standard or the council adopting it can't say why we think this is important and necessary. So if you are talking about stronger preservation standards, the why, the what, you know, why is this important? That has to be part of the discussion, because it's going to be Mary, it's going to be me, it's going to be other people trying to help write the findings that justify whatever changes we end up making. So yes, the why has to be a big part of your recommendations.
And inversely, like the why not?
Yes.
But I will say that the housing statute and the middle housing statute is relatively new in Oregon. So city council adopting a new code like this one, and my legal opinion would be especially subject to legal scrutiny from developers and from the courts in LUBA, because housing is such a hot issue. So I would just say it's beyond, everybody knows the policy that we want trees and we want urban canopy, but just saying that as a general concept, I don't think it's going to be enough. I think we are going to have to show why this site is still developable and why we are not adding costs and delay and taking houses. Like if a developer can show, I lost 5 houses on this site, I think we have to be cautious of that, because housing is such a strong policy basis in Oregon now, and that is new.
Yeah.
So you're gonna have to look at, site design and have ways that a develop, and we just heard about drainage, that there's nothing a developer can do about an issue like that. So you can't just have broad statements of value. We can have those, but I don't think that will be enough standing alone.
And does like mitigation and fee in lieu help ease that at all?
Definitely,
Okay.
definitely having other options that aren't too costly.
Yeah.
Right, but yes, definitely you want to look at those carefully.
I've always thought that, when we think about clear and objective, purple trees is clear and objective, right? You can scan it and get the right Pantone color. It's arbitrary though. And so whatever place where we can steer from being arbitrary and capricious in the recommendations we make, I think strengthen whatever the recommendation is, because we are doing good work. Like this discussion, it's healthy. We don't agree on some things, but we are reviewing information as opposed to just saying I like or don't like. Because that puts us, I think, at a much greater risk of having it not be what we wanted it to be. Regardless of, I'm not specifically like lawsuits or whatever, but if it doesn't do what we want it to do, then it's not been a good use of our hours.
I think, Jeff, you mentioned at the last meeting that basically everything is going to add cost, right? I mean, anything is going to add cost. The question that Ian brings up is that isn't clear and concise, right? The law isn't, right? It's just undue.
Yeah, is it an unreasonable cost that
Right.
causes, it discourages housing, right? And
I think Chris's point, though, which is something that we can kind of fall back on, and Kathy made the same point, is that most other entities that have codes, it's just very specific, and most of them are 6 inches. So we can fall back on that, and it's not what we may choose to, we just have to inventory them, right? I mean, that's all we're asking. And so it seems simple.
I do think the challenge though is of all the stuff we could find, very few of them were high desert, rain shade.
I could only find two.
Yeah, exactly, which is a bit of a challenge because the stuff just doesn't grow that fast.
Right.
Which doesn't mean that we shouldn't save them, but it's like, I wish they grew faster here, because then we could say, okay, there actually is a difference, or there are some other pieces of information here, because what grows, everything grows in the valley.
Right.
And they have good codes for that, right? And so that makes it a little trickier for us here, where we really are talking about two types of trees and some maples, you know?
Similarly, Jim, a lot of comparisons have been made to jurisdictions in Washington that a state that doesn't have assimilated housing statutes that we have
Also
as
good
well.
point,
So
yeah.
just another.
Are you saying land use is weird in Oregon?
I'm saying you need housing.
So can we just recommend we axe Senate Bill 100 and then we go from there? That's my job.
I just got one more thing.
Yeah.
I just do, well, and maybe it doesn't change as people's votes, but I haven't heard anything as a developer that we've done. Obviously, this all adds costs. I mean, unreasonable costs. I haven't heard anything yet, but certainly delays, like changing the mapping to 6 to 6 will absolutely cause delays. It's changing the code. I don't think that the mapping is what's causing trees to be removed right now. I think it's actually the vagueness or no clear on how to save those trees that were mapped, right? It's not that the way they were mapped or they weren't mapped. And so by changing how we're mapping them now will cause delays, because we're changing something that people going out and doing surveys, they're going to have to, it's going to take longer to survey it. But I think the real issue where the real delay is going to come in, and I was trying to kind of bring it up, and I thought, Dan, you brought up a good point in terms of percentages, but I also think that it kind of falls into my argument, which is if you go in with an application and now you show more trees, but now you're actually reducing the number of trees you have to save, by the percentage, you're actually taking out more trees, which creates kind of a community issue, which causes more appeals, more concerns on council, planning commission, just the process. I think that whether we like that or not, I do think that will cause delays in the process.
Well, and as we mentioned, the 6 and 6, once we get through. What we are regulating, we can come back and talk about the mapping. If we're like, well, that's unnecessary really, because we landed over here on what we're actually going to regulate. We can come back and revisit the 6 and 6.
Right.
That's just to get us moving forward so we can get into the next discussion.
Kathy and then Dan.
Well, I was just going to mention, in the way I think of it, Chris brought it up, but I don't think the point came through very clearly, is if you're showing more trees and they're in the periphery, you can be saving those trees and say, look, I'm saving all these trees, because the neighbors are going to see all the trees regardless of what size they are. And when I've worked with arborists, they're very quick. They do it all in a day, regardless of what size tree they're doing. So I don't think delay is an issue, but I think it gives you an opportunity to show you're saving more trees rather than. It can be seen in two different ways, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility of what you're saving is all. At least in my experience, that's what it does.
Yeah, just in development, it's really hard when you put in the right of way and you put in all the services, and you put in the houses, there's not a lot left of land, especially when we've got density and we've got needed housing. There's just not a lot left to save other through mitigation. Now, if we come together, and I'm all for it, identifying really good, important, significant trees and saving those, that's good. But I think as a community, the reality is if you go into a site and your density is 5 to 7 units per acre, something in the middle, there's not a lot of trees left to save in the process. And so by showing more, you're going to have to show taking out more too in the process, unless you cheat the system, which is develop it, leave the trees, and then just know the builder's going to take them down afterwards.
Which is not a good idea.
No,
I understand.
absolutely. That's why I'm saying.
I understand. I understand.
As another developer at the table, I can't not respond to that. We don't, we take the trees into consideration at the outset, and I think the code, but because of the middle housing code, there's a lot more flexibility in the development styles. That you can build and that the community wants nowadays. And so there, I think there's flexibility that's offered there. But since Councilor Perkins is in the room, the direction from council, I think, on the tree code is not going to fully address the community's concerns. And to Corey's point, once you put in roadways and sidewalks at the size of right of way that the city of Bend engineering department demands, there really isn't much left. And so that's a big part of the problem. And it's not our charge, unfortunately, but I'm going to encourage this committee again and again and again to send that feedback to council so that that does get addressed.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have a good list of things related to
That wasn't
other
good.
stuff we recommend. Since you asked.
I know.
Here's more.
Since the door was open.
And when we were sort of going through the interview process with the committee, we've talked about, I mean, there may be, a time after this that this group reconvenes and starts going through all of the stuff that
Other
goes in the
ways to
bike
say
rack,
Yeah.
but which is important stuff, so yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
Let's say, I think Kavi and Dan were in the queue. Dan?
Yeah, this sort of takes the conversation back to housing and the word needed in front of housing considerations. We mentioned middle, the missing middle housing.
All housing is needed.
Okay, so that was what I wanted to clarify is either, so it's just housing considerations or needing housing considerations is all housing.
Wasn't always that way, but all housing is.
Okay, yeah, I wanted that clarification.
Rules.
Perfect.
And if you're interested in deeper dive on that, when the city of Bend had Econ Northwest do some analysis on this, you can see where all the housing improves the housing stock.
Okay.
Even the stuff that's counterintuitive all adds to it because somebody moves to that who was running something that somebody else couldn't go into, and it's really interesting. Sorry for that sidebar, but it's data heavy there.
Thanks.
Kavi?
I was just gonna add, coming into this committee also, I see my role as balancing the two things, I think all of us do. And I think what would be helpful, even as we did this vote on the 6 and 6, is not having a lot of knowledge on the development side, having a little bit better understanding for this vote, but also for future as we go through this process, having a better understanding of what that cost benefit is, and having a better understanding of what the monetary cost is or what the delay cost is would be really helpful before we take a vote on any issue, if that's possible to get that information. I'm sure it's not as easy as getting that information, but if there's examples to draw from, or if there's other inventories that have been done where it would show it would increase the time by a day, or it would increase cost by 10%, whatever.
Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think equally important would be also a kind of breakdown of exactly what our real land supply is, right? Once we are accepting for parking, once we're accepting for stormwater, once we're accepting for, we also have a component in our code that requires preservation of geologic features, and then ultimately preservation of trees. What really are we looking at in terms of units per acre, units per square foot? However we determine that we want to look at that, because it's critical that we're actually understanding, as Ian alluded to, that at a certain point we're limiting and in fact could be reducing housing units due to preservation standards, and that trade-off, even including mitigation, is a really critical component of this discussion that we need to keep in mind.
To just make sure I understood correctly, not the inventory piece itself, but other things we consider as we go along the process would reduce the available land.
Things that already exist, that are already required. Adding, depending on how we approach tree preservation, that can, we just need to recognize that we are reducing developable land per lot, per acre.
So that was another cost to kind of make aware for the committee for any possible changes we're considering.
And I wouldn't even call it a cost. I mean, it's more significant than a cost, quite frankly. I mean,
So an example to try to illustrate is stormwater management. The code in Central Oregon became very progressive a couple of years ago, but that means there's a lot more land now that has on a development site that has to go to stormwater management. And that's like an area that's near and dear to my heart, but now that I live here, I'm like, geez, why don't we just do drill holes for stormwater? Like, stormwater just needs to get back into the aquifer. And honestly, like, it's so expensive to do stormwater treatment in Central Oregon. Like, it would really save a lot of costs to make housing more affordable if we could just do drill holes. But we have this stormwater that policy that makes it kind of hard, you know? And this is coming from a bleeding heart environmentalist, okay? Like, and that's where I'm at on that right now.
Stormwater soils suck as a space. I'm not gonna
They do.
recommend that we build multifamily with stormwater soils and tell kids to go out and play in them. I mean, like, so we have to take into consideration, like, if we want quality open space and we want real stormwater management and, you know, like this all, you're chipping away at the actual developable square footage on the lot.
It's sort of like the gross yield versus the net yield. Once you know, an acre is 0.6 of an acre for actual housing by the time you do all the things you have to do, and it's worse if it's a corner and all of that stuff. So, yeah, I think that's the part where we can put some sort of context to it to try to give an idea, because it's the developer hat says the challenge we run into is each one of these things on its own is great. You know, it's kind of like all the SDCs individually. Yes, we want streets. Yes, we want whatever. Yes, we want parks. But in the individual, but the sum of them all together, this is one of the most expensive permits in the state. You know, and those things are great, but it's also that is in the cost of housing, right? I'm not railing against SDCs. It's just it's 5 o'clock somewhere. But it's the sum total of those things, right? And we don't want the tree code to be the final straw. We want it to enhance things, not just be another thing that potentially raises the cost and then already, you know, we already have an $800,000-900,000 median home cost here. So,
Yeah, and I wonder if that's something we can get to when we talk about mitigation, if there are creative solutions of, say, capping like a fee, like if the site truly is not able to be developed with all these different factors. So the tree code isn't the thing tipping it over the edge for development. So I feel like once we get to mitigation, that could be a good time to talk about all that.
yes. So we voted the 6-inch across the board is the next step, or is where we've landed as a group. The next step is we need to talk about the priority trees. So this is where we get into the 20 versus 24 discussion that we started last time. The next conversation is going to be, what do we recommend? I'm going to hand this to Pauline because she has a spreadsheet.
And there's a lot of numbers up on the board, so I apologize, but the group did ask for me to look at different sites that have trees on them that are currently underdeveloped or have been developed, and look at 20-inch trees on those sites and also 24-inch trees on those sites. So I looked at 5 different properties or developments, and one of them is, and it's kind of a mix all over town, so it's not all focused on the east side or the northwest side. So Gateway is where the new Costco is going to go, and it's a avoided application, but it was for a multi-unit development on a little over 9 acres. The Sky Vista and the Poplar developments are both just single family developments. And
Where are they?
so the Gateway North is where the Costco is going to go.
Right.
Sky Vista is off 27th, so I'd say the
East side.
yeah. Poplar, where's the Poplar?
Is off of Brookswood. Yeah,
Southwest.
It is southwest from your main village. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the Century mixed use is across the street from Safeway on Century.
Yeah.
And then the Viridian multi-unit apartments, that is in the northwest. And varied size of properties like Poplar's down to a ½ acre, and the largest ones are a little over 9 acres. But you can see like the total number of trees on each of those sites varies significantly, but even like the Poplar site being as small as it is, it still had quite a high number of trees. And then the total DBH, is, variable with the number of trees that are actually on site. The Poplar, again, having quite a bit of DBH on the site compared to like the Viridian multi-use permit is only 200 DBH higher, but it was, an acre or two larger. And then you see the variation on the trees that are priority 20 inches versus 24 inches. So Sky Vista has the highest number. Out of the 94 trees, 30 of them are 20 inches or greater. That includes obviously the 24 inches or greater too. And then the lowest one would be the Gateway multi-unit development with 9 and 4. But they did have 67 trees on site, just not a lot of large significant or priority trees. And then the two gray ones, Sky Vista, the dark gray and the Viridian are the two. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail to show you how that 20 and 24 inches works. And I included the options, which you have a sheet in front of you just to help follow. I'm not saying we have to adopt any of these options. It just gives you an idea, like if you start playing around with percentages on a 20-inch preservation standard versus a 24-inch preservation standard, what that may look like. And these percentages, you know, again, with the needed housing and the discussion we just had with cost, I would probably say are a little bit high. And if we go with something similar to this, then we could reduce those percentages to get to the council's goal of preserving either a 20-inch or 24-inch, but then some urban canopy in general for the properties. So Sky Vista, this is the one that was on 27th. And the blue stars represent all the trees that are 20 inches or greater. And then the green stars are the 24 inches that were on site. This site had 50 junipers, it had 20, for some reason, the arborist or report did deciduous and maples. I would assume they're the same. And then they separated junipers from the pines and evergreens. So there's 50 junipers, 20 deciduous trees, and 24 pines and evergreens. And on this site, the stars you can see, and as Corey was talking about, you know, a lot of the stars are in the building envelopes for development. They are in the streets that are going to be put in. And then the ones with the circle are the two that were preserved on site. So, you know, obviously we need some type of preservation standard to get at council's goal of preserving some larger trees. And that will be our next discussion, is what's that percent. But this just gives you an idea of the spread of the 20 inches and the 24 inches. So this breaks it down just a little bit more. And I'm sorry if this seems confusing, but I'm going to try my best. So Sky Vista again has 94 trees on site. The total DBH on site is 1,739. And of the 94 trees, 30 trees again were over 20 inches. So this was one of the higher ones that had a significant number of larger trees. So 20 inch trees, there's 30 of them. If we went with option 1, which is on your handout, just to give you an idea, if we wanted to preserve 100% of those trees, you would have to preserve all 30 of those trees that measure 20 inches or greater. And if you did that, and we went with something like this, and in addition to the preservation of larger trees and having also a percentage for just in general canopy, those large trees would be more than enough. And you wouldn't need to preserve any additional trees. Whereas option 2 is preserving 75% of the large trees. So instead of preserving all 30, you would only have to preserve 23 of these trees. And then you're still preserving enough urban canopy, you wouldn't have to preserve any smaller trees. And then option 3 is where you only preserve 50% of the priority trees, so you only have to preserve 15. And that doesn't quite preserve enough canopy with this option. You'd have to preserve an additional 140. And again, that's why I'm saying these percentages to me seem a little bit high, especially if you're preserving a lot of larger trees. And then the 24-inch study, I'm gonna look from up here. Yeah, okay, so 24 inches. So we have the same DBH on site, and there's only 20 trees. So because we are now only preserving, in this case, larger trees, so no longer 20 inches, but 24 inches or greater, it reduces the number of large trees that would need to be preserved on site. So option 1, your 100% of preservation of the large trees would be 20 versus 30. And that is still going to provide enough canopy where you wouldn't have to preserve additional 20% of the entire canopy, because those 20 trees go above and beyond preserving a lot of canopy on site. And then option 2, you would only have to preserve 15 of those large 20 trees. And then in addition to that, you'd only have to preserve an additional 23 inches, which is another arborist, maybe 2 or 3 more trees. And then option 3, you would do, you would preserve 50%. So instead of preserving all 20, you're down to only having to preserve 10 of those large trees. But you would be bumping up on preserving some other trees on site to get an overall canopy for the site. So this is just giving you an idea of what a 20-inch preservation standard may look like versus a 24-inch preservation
And when you
standard.
compare to what is fairly standard looking single family subdivision on the previous slide. They could only manage to preserve 2 significant trees. So if we're talking about 20 versus 10 versus 15, it kind of see how that can be challenging.
Yeah, that's, it would be interesting. I mean, just looking at it, I could be wrong, so no facts to back it up, but just looking at it and seeing the shape and doing enough development, looking at this, it doesn't feel like there would be a way to meet any one of those options without reducing the number of houses. And significantly increasing the costs. And so what would be interesting is maybe it's worth our time to have an engineer or something try to do. I mean, cool, we could, you can save all those trees and do that. It's just, it looks like it would be pretty near impossible to do that.
I'm curious, the building footprints just show like basically the whole buildable area, and a house doesn't have to take up the whole buildable area. Some of those trees are very close to the side yard setback, so
And the rear setbacks.
yeah, so the house does not necessarily or even will take up that whole area, so I think it's kind of deceiving to say, well, all the trees have to go because this is where the house is going to go.
When you get into
Depends.
the density.
Yeah, it
that
depends on the
size,
density.
It is, I mean, you see it now, driving around, there's not a lot of yard with density requirements these days, and so. And if you have a 24-inch tree, I don't know, Chris may know this better, but there's risk sometimes when you build. Right next to it and you damage the root structure and those types of things, so. Not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying, sometimes that's the case, is that it is harder than it looks on paper.
If you're in the RL zone.
Yeah.
Then you
Yeah.
can save some, but not in RM.
Yeah, RS though, which that subdivision is RS, and I don't know the average lot size of those, but
Sorry, what's RS and what's R?
residential standard density.
Okay.
So I'm gonna guess it's probably, well, minimum lot size in the RS is 4,000 square feet, so it's a minimum 4,000 square feet. Maybe some are 4,000 to 6,000 square feet, like the flag lot number 50.
Pauline, do any of the codes look at now where, like even in the RS zone where every lot is allowed to have an ADU or a duplex or triplex? If you did have the trees, what would happen if somebody wanted to add on into their house? We have to allow that under state law.
Right.
What happens if
standards?
you have a tree that's in the way, or that's an existing, that's an existing development, so they
Yeah.
would be allowed to
Yes.
develop,
Is that
notwithstanding the code?
However, if you wanted to build I don't remember what the term is, you had a conversation with my wife about it. Is it called a detached ADU?
Yeah, accessory.
Where you're cutting off that piece of land and it's becoming its own unit?
Land division.
No.
You're creating a land division, and so you're doing a detached ADU, doing a land division.
Well, it's not land division, so a accessory dwelling unit or an ADU is just a second unit on the property, but it's still on the same property. There's also, I think what you're talking about is Senate Bill 458, which is the middle housing land division. So you could have 2 units on a lot, we would call that a duplex, and they would be on their own lots.
Right.
But
So if you did that, though, you would be subject to this, where a standard ADU, you would not.
so the way we're gonna write the applicability for this, it doesn't apply to single family
Okay.
developments, ADUs, duplexes, triplex, or quad. So a person would come in and build a duplex, they're not subject to this tree standards.
Right.
And then they would be able to go through Senate Bill 458, still not subject. So this again, just for the groups, for projects that are going through site plan review, so like your Costco, your shopping centers, mixed use developments. And then multi-unit, so 5 units or more would go through this preservation standard, or land divisions. This land division would also go through
Is
it.
there a reason for that? What is the reason for that?
So in middle housing, you have to treat everything the same and process wise, or not process wise, but we haven't had standards for that yet. It would be more restrictive. And council's goal is really looking at larger properties, larger developments like your Safeways and Costco's and mixed use developments. And not the smaller properties. Smaller properties, I mean, if you have a 5,000 square foot lot and want to put a quadplex on, and we come in and say that you have to preserve 10% of the site of the trees. I think that gets in the way of the middle housing.
All right, we have some additional comments. I don't know, Kathy or Karen, which of you had your hand up?
I've had it for a little while, and I'm concerned, that I do this type of design work, and to me, density is huge. I mean, it depends on what kind of density level you're talking about as to whether it's even feasible at all to save anything. And basically between the stormwater and the streets, sidewalks, right of ways and setback, it's just really, really difficult. To me, what makes more sense is looking at the mitigation, because I think as we move forward, we're going to be developing more and more dense. And I'm so sorry. I'm pushing back a little bit on even preserving a percentage on site. I mean, it would be great to do, but I think in most cases, as we move forward in our greater densities, we're really more looking at mitigation. So are we mitigating for the 20-inch trees or mitigating for 24-inch? I'm used to more saving what I can, but mitigating. And not looking at actually a specific percentage on site, even though I think it's ideal. I just think the direction that we're going in terms of density is going to be very, very difficult to preserve certain percentages on site. And I didn't know if there was going to be a discussion on, well, if you're at X density, you just mitigate, or, you know, if you're low density, yeah, sure, you could do it. But I think we're moving more in the direction of the higher density. So I'm concerned about trying to target a percentage of saving on site, to be honest. I just want to put it out there. I would rather look at us requiring certain amounts of mitigation, reasonable amounts of mitigation, both either planting on site in a way that is adding to value of the subdivision, or doing an in lieu fee where these trees could be planted where it would be helpful for the Parks Department, for instance, to add more trees.
I assume with that option, though, you'd need some type of percent to know what percent needs to be mitigated.
Right.
Correct, but not saying absolutely they have to be saved on site, because you are going to lose.
And that's not what this is. So after
Okay.
we come up with, if going 20-inch, 24-inch, the next step is talking about what is the percent for preservation? And then the next step after that is talking about the mitigation. So if you can't preserve that certain percent, whatever we come up with, then you have the in lieu fee option or the replacement on site or even off site. And that was in the scope that council directed us. with.
Okay, great.
And the next example Colleen has is multi-unit residential too. If you want
Yeah,
to
good.
see how that sort of site layout works.
Let's hear from Karen real quick and then Chris.
Two thoughts. Mitigation, my viewpoint is worthless. You take a site plan like this, the developer is truly going to be able to say, to get the density that the state needs, the Bend needs, I have to have that. And I would gladly pay for X number of trees to be planted elsewhere. For people living on the east side of town like me, that means that our areas will continue to be clear cut. And some other part of town is going to get a lot of new trees, but it's not going to be us. Second, I look at the site plan. I'm not an engineer, and I'd really like to get their input on this. I think the problem is then standards and specifications. You have a 60-foot right of way. You're requiring a planter strip 5 feet, sidewalk 5 feet, 40-foot pavement, another 5-foot planter strip, another 5-foot sidewalk. We are never going to be able to save any trees unless we change the specifications. In other words, reduce the right of way to 50 feet. Allow sidewalks on only one side of the street, or even no sidewalks at all. I live in Kings Forest, and we have, of course, a 60-foot right of way, which is full of old ponderosas. No one there wants a sidewalk. We do not want the standard city street. We walk our dogs, we bicycle. And this to me is the problem. It's the city specs. Why can't we change the right of way from 60 feet down to 50 feet, for example? This is a non-engineer speaking, of course.
There are options to do different pavement widths, but there's options for different pavement widths.
Well,
In some areas, so you can have larger landscape strips and you can meander
I've
sidewalks.
talked
There's some
with
flexibility.
the engineers. I did this like 4 years ago. I sat down with some engineers because you look at the bend standards and specifications, it provides for waivers. But the waivers are not connected to preserving trees. And I talked to someone in the city who said, oh, it's easy to get a waiver. The engineers I talked to say it's like pulling teeth. I think you need to change the rules, the bend specs, so you don't have to hassle with waivers. So that you have plans that allow the planners to just do a design that saves trees. I met with Polish 4 years ago. I met with Hayden Homes. And I asked if you had an extra 10 feet of right of way, would you be able to design to save more trees? The answer was, of course we would. That to me was a problem. It's, forgive me, the city.
Well, so noted. I do think that should go on our list of big things with the arborist questions and other details that we want to have to tag on. We do.
And I'm breaking it now because I think it's a biggie.
Yeah, understood. Chris, real quick.
Yeah, so jumping on, I don't even know, babe. First I want to apologize to developers if I offended anyone. I'm very pro development. A lot of you guys hire me for this work.
Oh, declaration of actual conflict.
You can recall and ask,
Yeah. But I think Corey makes a great point. I think Karen made a good point too. I'm all about tree preservation, but we have to do it intelligently as well. It's got to work with that. Quite often if I get called after the design phase, there's little I can do. It's like, oh, can we put a building right here next to this tree? I'm like, no, not really. And so in the design phases where a lot of this tree preservation is going to happen. And so I think we need to be, and I think Corey called that. You look at some places like Northwest Crossing. I've seen numerous trees in this area that have been preserved because they've been kind of hemmed in, but then because the buildings are too close, they are not a good, the term that we like to use is a safe and useful life expectancy. So it's not just about retaining the tree, but it's about how long is that tree going to actually benefit that area. And so I think another reason why preserving smaller trees might be beneficial. And this may be more towards the mitigation option, but because we were talking a lot about stormwater management in this issue, as well as maybe trees kind of out east, one of the things that I think this committee should take a look at is a technology called Silva cells. It's basically like a soil vaulter cell. So you can build, instead of using your standard sidewalk technology, you build, they kind of look like empty Legos, so to speak, and you put soil in there. It actually works as a stormwater management system because instead of those bioswales that are surface level, now you have a paved over soil vault, so to speak. The tree roots go in there. And I know how expensive stormwater management is, but trees transpire that water for free. It's pretty cool. And then one last thing I want to mention is as we're kind of goes in the accounting that we're talking about, the costs that are associated with the things. I think one of the things that we aren't factoring in is the benefits that trees provide. You'll see a lot of urban areas, municipalities on their tree maps. What they'll do is they'll actually show the valuation of these trees. When we start looking at the valuations that some of these trees have, it kind of counterbalances some of that cost. So it might cost a lot more, but if you started to factor in some of the benefits that are being removed from that community, then I think that'll get us a little bit closer. And that's going to be, a hard, if not impossible task to do. I'm not saying that we do that per se, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the trees do provide a good benefit. And so while we might have increased costs, we're actually just looking at the true valuation of what's happening when you remove a benefit from an area.
Thank you. You want to go to the next example?
Yeah, just to give
Okay.
you, so this is an apartment complex that's going on in the northwest area of Washington and Shevlin. And it had surprisingly 48 junipers on site and 12 ponderosas. The green stars represent the much larger 24-inch trees, and the blue is the 20-inch trees. And these are the parking areas here. And then, the big apartment complexes, some open space here in the middle and here. And then all along, the back and the setbacks. And this development is preserving 3 trees. So just an idea of a site that is predominantly junipers. And I believe it was a mix of juniper and pondos that were being preserved, if I remember correctly.
I was just gonna make sure I understood correctly. So there's There's more of the 24+ inch trees than there are 20 to 24 inch trees.
The blue stars are the 20 inches or greater, which include the green. But the green are only 20 inches or greater. So on site, you can see there's a number of pretty large trees, 24 inches. And a smaller number of the 20 inches, but that would capture all the green.
And I think most of those were condos. Is my memory.
Is that common for there to be less 20 to 23 inches? Just because it's a smaller range, I guess.
The 24 inches, yeah, so you have less 24 inches, you'll have more 20.
Well, this is showing the other around, I think.
Well, the 20, includes 24 inches as well.
Got
it.
I think, and
So all
also,
of them should be blue, but to identify the 24 inches, to help those stand out.
and this is all gonna be highly variable depending on the site. I mean, some areas will have better soils, some areas will have, you know, aspect might be different, so.
So then, oh, go ahead.
Does the city have a waiver of a certain amount of parking in order to preserve uses?
There's no minimum parking requirement, so they didn't have provided
They didn't,
parking.
okay.
But
That's
this
right.
was probably designed before
that.
minimums went away.
Yes, okay, gotcha.
Actually, I did have another question I forgot to ask. I'm curious on the density. Is that based on the square footage of the home or what is the density?
It's based on the zone, so the project we looked at before is called standard density residential, and it's 4 to 7.3 units to per acre. I believe this is zoned RH or RM.
If it's the one right on the corner, it's RH.
RH, so then that goes up to 43 units to the acre. And the minimum, I think, is 22.5,
21.7.
21.7, yes.
Sorry, it's still all in here.
So you have to meet the minimum of 21.7 units to the acre, but you can go as high as 43 units to the acre.
And a unit has a minimum square footage. No.
Nope.
What is a unit defined as?
It has a kitchen and sleeping area and cooking system.
Individual
Yeah.
dwelling.
Yeah, so this apartment complex could be a mix of studios, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom units. We don't look at how many bedrooms are in each unit, we just count the number of units. So similar study, just to go through it, comparing if we were to require a percentage of 20-inch trees to be preserved versus 24 inches. This one had a total, again, 60 trees on site. The total DBH was 912, and there was only 14 trees that were 20 inches or greater and 11 trees that were 24 inches or greater. And so if you go through the options, the number of 20 inches, option 1 would require you to preserve all those large trees. Option 2 reduces that down to 75%, and then option 3 down to 50%. And with option 1 and 2, they wouldn't have to provide any additional canopy. Option 3, they would have 86 inches that they'd have to do. And then if you bump up the trees that you're preserving, the 24 inches, you only have to preserve 11, 8, or 6. And then again, options 1 and 2, those trees that are 24 inches or greater would meet that total urban canopy. And then if you only preserve 6 on site, then you would have to preserve additional canopy through some of the smaller trees that are on site. So again, if we start talking about those 6-inch trees, if you are to map them and we are going to say some of those could be preserved, that could help you build up to that 116. This study, though, was only me counting trees that were 6 inches and 10 inches, not all of them at 6 inches.
Could I try to, I'm absorbing this, so on the lower study, the 24-inch study. Am I saying it right if I say, okay, option 1, you're preserving 100% of the priority trees.
Right.
You're over providing on DBH. Arguably the best outcome, but maybe the hardest to do. The middle one, it's almost a wash.
Right.
Under when you have to provide, at the lowest one, you have to provide extra because you're only doing half.
Right.
Versus the top, the 20-inch study, it's like you're over providing, I don't want to say over providing, I'm gonna pick a different word, but. The 50% option is the one where you'd have to preserve anything else.
Yeah, same with option 3. You'd have preserved 86 up here and 116.
Would there be any benefit to letting the developer decide which option they want to do and give them The rain.
That's an option.
I mean, so that you could decide per
I
site.
guess the reason I was, yeah, I think the reason I was bringing it up was trying to get to the point of deciding between 20 and 24 and based on these percentages as per, like, we can dial the percentages too. And what's the way to make it flexible? I'd love 2 options, 3 is probably manageable, but like, I'm thinking about the number of extra pages of analysis you have to have as a developer to analyze these 3 options. I mean, it's probably just clicking something in CAD, but maybe it's harder than that. Like, to figure out which one works the best, because it's not just the layers of trees, but then it's the permutations of aligning the streets and 60-foot width and the versions that you get to have to go through to try to figure out which one you can meet.
And actually, yeah, and because I think, I think Brett and I have been able to chat a lot, but I'd love to hear more from the developers on some of those challenges, because historically, and I think I've worked with a bunch of different developers, some don't necessarily fall in the sky, but for the most part, though, I feel like a lot of developers I work with, it's kind of like the comment you made, is that they get the buildable envelope and they just kind of put the house there. I've been on some developments where they work around these larger trees, but around here, it seems like more often than not, I'm brought in again after the design period. The designs are already in place and I'm kind of a box to check in terms of, okay, now I need to capture the trees. This is the condition of the tree. Here you go. And as part of the land use permitting versus in some areas or with some developments I've seen, if you go in beforehand, you collect the trees and then the project is designed around it. And I'm curious on the developer side or architect or whomever wants to speak out to this, what are the challenges with those approaches? How do you approach development? Yeah, it's kind of an open question, I guess.
Can I jump in, because I drive the design for my civil engineer, and you always get the tree report first. I work around the trees as much as possible, and I design the roads so that they can save as many trees as possible. But I'm also working in cities that have really strict tree codes and neighbors that freak out and can kill projects if you're taking out too many trees, which is different than here, but that is an ideal, but it's not going to drive the best return necessarily for the developer, because it's probably more cost effective to do what you've seen, where you come in and you just do the design. I mean, to me, I prefer working the first way, but I recognize that has a cost associated with it.
Well, and Kathy, forgive me for being crass, but your developer has a number of units that need to get out of the ground in order to make the.
Correct, and I do meet those numbers.
Well, I don't doubt that.
I do meet those numbers.
But
It's
it's true,
true.
there is less creativity when land costs a certain amount, units
Yes.
cost a certain amount,
Yes.
at a certain point.
Yes.
That's all.
Yes, and that's why mitigation is mitigation on site is so important, because. And I also, there's no easy lots left. They're almost all covered in trees and sloped and have rock outcroppings. So, it's, you do the best you can.
It's a good question for sure.
I mean,
I mean, I think we all drive around and look at Northwest Crossing and some of the, the neighborhoods in the West Hills, and they're beautiful. The homes are gorgeous, the neighborhood's great, They also cost $300 or $400 or $800 or $1.5 million more than the homes in the rest of Bend. And as a developer, I mean, those are fun. They're beautiful. Love to do it if you could sustain it, but it's not the needed housing that Bend needs. And the reason why it costs more is because if you have, like in Northwest Crossing, for example, you have a lot and you've got a beautiful, 30-inch pine tree right in the middle. You can't just take, order a plan online that you bought for $3,500, or you have to go pay an architect probably $75,000 to $100,000 to design it. So right there, all of a sudden the house is $100,000 more, right? And then if you look at a house, there's a reason why when you look at developers and builders that build a lot of homes, why when you look down from the top like a bird, you don't see a lot of jogs in it, right? It's usually fairly boxy, and it's cost. All those every little jog, just keeps adding up. So, I mean, that's the reason. To answer your question, that's the gist of the reason of why you don't see that very often.
And Chris, they're talking largely about single family dwellings, although Kathy did some beautiful cottage clusters that I don't want to overlook, but.
And
I think-
multifamily.
Well, so that's the thing, right, is that because there are no easy lots anymore, we have these infill projects that are, because of our needed housing mix, multifamily as well, right, or kind of a slightly more challenging middle housing types. So when you're looking at those, it's a challenge because of how the lot is oriented, it's a challenge because of wherever the utilities are surrounding the lot, it's a challenge because of, as we've mentioned numerous times, stormwater management. It's not as simple as just like, we got a greenfield development and we're going to go, so we do have to be kind of creative, and when we're being creative in terms of, I shouldn't say we, because I don't actually do anything. When they are being creative, it's again, I hesitate to even say cost, because it's a loss, like we are losing units and we cannot as a city afford to lose units. So I don't know, I don't mean to be so melodramatic, but that's kind of what we're dealing with.
I think Karen brings up a great point, though, in terms of changing a lot of the city standards to be more flexible, to vote out, like the cottage cluster and sisters, we vote out to save a tree, and if you can do that, and then I've also worked with the kind of stormwater systems you're describing, and it's also the tree wells type systems. If we can have a little bit more flexibility on how we address the stormwater issues, I think would be very helpful too. So that's another story.
That's a good on the list we're keeping, which I am, of the side notes, that certainly goes in there.
And go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna tie it into the development thing. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I was gonna go it from a site development. I mean, all sites differ. I don't know if these were all flat sites or they had topo on them. So it's interesting when you're working on a site with topo, it's a little bit.
Significant topo on the apartment side.
Yeah, it's a little bit harder sometimes to save trees, sometimes topo, and not all lots are square. So there is some design influence on a lot to be able to meet the topo, to be able to get the density that, has a little bit extra consideration for tree preservation that can be thought through, that can help. And then I think there's a lot of tools to work with. Karen, you mentioned, narrower streets. There's a great conference coming up next week on Booners.
Or eliminate sidewalks
Yeah,
altogether.
you eliminate sidewalks, you have Booners, or you have shared streets. So,
ADA drives a lot.
right, so there is a lot of tools to work with in street width and sidewalks. And the other tool to work with is preservation standards. There's prescriptive standards that are very straightforward. And then there's more performance standards where you get a consulting arborist on board. And you say, hey, we can save this tree, even if we really have a little bit of influence on one side. So I think there's a lot of tools to work with that are more fine tuning a site, even if it has to be straight and very structured, that we can work through to help, be a little bit more thoughtful.
Not that housing are cars, but I think the challenge that we see is, we would have no $20,000 vehicles available to us if it weren't for value engineering and the ability to do the same thing basically over and over again, different colors, different cloth on the seats and things like that. And in housing, the opportunity to value engineer and have a couple different roof lines and change colors, but to have the things make sense, like that is a big part of housing affordability.
Right.
And I work in the bespoke world, and the tens of thousands of dollars that go into design and engineering, because you can't prescriptive path something that is bespoke very often, like that is in the cost, and that's for a client who can afford it. But when we're talking about trying to just add housing, like it's the footprint has to be repeated, which then drives a fairly basic lot shape, which drives a fairly basic layout within the subdivision. So the permutations of the subdivisions that I've been through in the past have been tricky, because we're saying, okay, we have to connect to this street and this street. And then within it, we have a whole bunch of versions that we have to churn through to figure out how to get there. And the yield is that's just a huge part of the calculation to figure out whether it'll even happen. And I don't think the saving of it or not saving of a tree is going to kill too many land deals, but like there is a point at which it doesn't happen. And if our code that we recommend to test here, even if we come back to it in a couple of years, which I think we are going to do, we need to have something to get some projects to analyze, so that we can make sure that we're we have enough data at the review time to be able to feel like we are making an informed decision when the code gets revised.
And I'm not sure how these numbers would line up, because I don't know what the cost is to have to make that extra site design decision to work around trees, but. If there is going to be this fee in lieu pot of money, and we're talking about equity, and we're talking about multifamily units and under canopied areas, like, is there a way for that pot of money to help influence more creative site design for those types of properties, or is that money not even close to? Like, I'm kind of curious
Yeah.
how that pot would help or not help
Most of the cost
realistically.
that I saw, I mean, it's impossible to say right now a dollar number, but the biggest issue, like with those designs, and to your point, Karen, which I think is great, like the current city's, standards that we have to meet. There's no way to design that and meet any one of these options without reducing the number of lots.
Yeah.
And so I guess if you wanted to look at that and say, the average lot and then probably on that side is $150,000 to $175,000. So every lot you reduce, not only does it take a house out of the system, it's, it costs the developer $175,000.
So it's not just creative site design, it's.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Karen's point, there are ways with some variances in the code and things like that, that you can do more creative. But when you have a site like that and it's so small and you have to meet these entrance, exit and street standards, it's just very limited.
Yeah.
You mentioned ADA. I mean, when you're doing multifamily, you have to provide those accessible routes, and the amount of slope is very, very limited, and you wind up doing quite a bit of grading just to meet that code, and that's a federal standard and you can't get around it. So it's tough on the multifamily.
Yeah.
I know it's later down the road, but to Karen's point again, which I think is great, if you want to see in the past when the city of Bend allowed some of the variances in road design and right away is a neighborhood we did called Stonegate off China Hat, where it's much more natural, save tons of pine trees, and be a good one to drive through, because as we get into that decision down the road, it would be really good to look at that.
Actually, secondly, I've walked that neighborhood. That's a beautiful neighborhood. You guys did a great job there.
Thanks.
But I think that would be cool if we could do a field trip somehow and look at some. That'd be fun to get a.
Field trip.
Kavi?
Could I ask a question for someone who doesn't understand how the planning process of this goes? So if there are, let's say there's a site that is being considered to be developed. And that there, I guess, is there a decision point that's on how it's decided on whether to build like single family or duplexes, triplexes, quads versus multifamily or commercial? I'm guessing it's depending on the zoning, but is there also like, because this is only applying to the commercial and multifamily side of things and not the single family and middle part of it, I'm just curious if this would incentivize more developers to start choosing instead of going multifamily, going the other way.
Well, the land division itself will preserve the trees.
So if it's a single family subdivision proposed, this would apply. What we're recommending would apply for that too. Yeah, it would be in an existing single family subdivision, a lot or a home that gets done would not be subject to this. It's already a recorded lot within a single, but if it's a piece of land that's going to become a subdivision or commercial or multifamily, then that would be subject to this code recommendation.
That's all.
So,
Yeah.
And I have a question. So on this particular development, there is, let's see, this is the Sky Vista, 30 trees that are 20 inches or greater. And as I mentioned, some of our those percentages are quite high. The goal of the council is to still somehow preserve a couple large trees on site. And I'm not a developer, but if they were able to preserve the two with the circles on them, I mean, and if, let's say we put in the code that you have to preserve 10% or 15%, so quite lower than the examples I showed you. Would that make a developer say, hey, we could probably preserve these 3 in the rear yard setbacks, because now we have a standard that requires you to think a little bit differently. Not a real strict standard, not the 50% or the 35 that we were looking at, but let's say we reduce it, but we can still get some larger trees. The developers in the room, would that make you think differently on lots 50, 52, and 54 about preserving those 3 trees in the back to meet a standard?
Yeah,
But because that standard's not in the code right now, it's probably easier to just take them out.
yeah, I mean, it still costs a little bit more just because you can't mass grade, which I think is irresponsible, but they did, that's what people do, right now, so the answer is yes. It will cost a little bit more to save those because you can't mass grade, which is the most cost effective way to develop, but I think absolutely. I just think we need to put something in the code, an option that's feasible,
Right.
so that everybody doesn't just turn to mitigation every time.
So we can still get to council's goal, preserving some of the larger trees and then have mitigation.
Wait, so just to clarify, how many more trees would be saved with that versus what actually happened?
So I think I did, look at my calculator or something. Well, I think I only did 15%, because there was what, 30,
Maybe 5 trees.
5 trees. So then you would get the 2 that are already circled plus the 3 in the back, and that's
Or
it.
150% of the trees that got saved.
Go all the way,
Well,
back.
you know-
Well, go all the way back to Karen's point, if you were able to meander that road a little bit.
All the trees.
Now you got some beautiful trees right there, you get to drive through every day and say.
But do you think that the infrastructure and the utilities that go on the street would still, and in the sidewalks or back of sidewalks would be an argument to remove those trees?
I think the 4 that are on Beal Drive, my eyes do look a little bit still. 2 of those 4 for sure, you could say.
So when I went through, I saved 16, but I wasn't deciding.
Some of those front yard
Yeah.
trees, right?
Also, there are technologies too, you can weave utilities underneath tree roots, so you don't need to do what we call a non-selective cut for utilities. There are ways you can weave utilities underneath as well.
I don't know about that when it comes to the Public Works Department or Engineering Department. You're not gonna leave any water or sewer line,
Well, maybe large ones, probably not.
not any service line either, not in the right of way.
So you need to have the
But you can put
flexibility on the right
rocks
of way.
at the ADA ramp
Mhm.
for some reason. Right. So, yeah, I think we're all on the same page there that we need to go. Move that as next, as part of our bullet points. So we have another project to look at real quick.
No.
Okay,
That was
so I think the discussion, the next thing that I need to drag a number out of everybody on is 20 versus 24. And this is the definition of the priority tree that would be subject to the percentages under each of the options. And we have not filed in the percentages. We have some numbers here that we needed to obviously have something to review. Is this around the room?
Yep.
Say a number.
So we had 20 minutes and I would like a vote within 20 minutes.
All right.
So we can each have a minute to kind of voice a little bit of
Yeah.
opinion and we can go.
To be clear, we're just identifying priority trees. They still could be removed.
Yes.
Correct.
There will be
Just leave
options
that
for
size.
that.
Copy.
Let's see, is it okay to go counterclockwise? Sue, would you like to provide any commentary?
Just here to listen.
All right.
Well, let's see, and know which direction the tide is bringing, but I would recommend starting at 24.
I'm pretty flexible. I just think there needs to be enough choice and options and flexibility with whatever we come up with so that it works, because every site's different. So I'm not gonna commit right now. I'd like to hear what other people say.
I'll go with 20.
20.
Yeah, I think some of it's Central Oregon, slower growth rates, and in a way, how we take that 20 and work with the code in terms of percentages gives perhaps more flexibility.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, wait, can I provide reasoning to mine? Sorry.
Yes, you're welcome to
Thank you.
provide reasoning.
Thank you, Dan, you inspired me, sorry. I think 24, just because the vast majority of the trees that we're gonna be talking about are juniper, they're a little slower growing, we need to consider the species, and so 24 is the threshold at which I think a juniper is reasonably safe.
Well, Dan. 20.
Feel like I still want more information, but I will go with 20, and I think the one concern I have as I make that vote is I don't want it to be the case where if you're having a percentage of total significant trees that are to be saved, that some of the 20 trees are saved and then some of the 24 trees are cut as a result, because the 20 or more trees are included in that total number. So I don't know if there's a way around that, but just acknowledging that as a possible kind of unintended effect.
So they might save a 21-inch, but not the 24.
Exactly, because if they have to save, percentage of total trees that are significant, let's say 50% or 70% or less than that. I just don't want it to have the unintended effect of then smaller trees being kept and larger trees being taken down.
That's probably something to put in, I mean, well, yes, noted. I'm already thinking about how. We have to get the what first.
I would say 20, but also agree that the flexibility is important and we'll have to get into that. But I think having more trees to work with gives more options with site design, hopefully. But I am also curious, we don't want to have folks just mitigate and not preserve. I think that was a good point. So figuring out that balance on the road is important, but 20.
Doesn't make much difference to me, but I think what we're getting at here is that the point at which the city's gonna start charging a removal fee, right? That's how this is gonna work. So.
Not a removal fee.
A mitigation fee.
Oh.
In lieu.
So, how big is that fee?
We get to, that's recommend percentages and then replacement and then fee and lieu. This is why we're gonna have an extra meeting.
And then that comparison chart, you'll see what other cities charge, and I'd say a majority of them was about 600 a tree. Portland bumps up to that 1,800 of a certain size, and then when it gets bigger than that, then it was several $100s per inch. And the reason they do that is it discourages people from just clear cutting a site because they're charging so much for the in lieu. But I would work with our finance department and make sure our fee is legally justified.
Okay, and
I'd say probably around 600. I'm guessing 600 because that seems to be the updates that a lot of cities did recently.
okay. I don't have any real strong feelings, but I'd go with the 24. But I think, there's things that make sites like we've seen that you cannot save trees for one reason or another. And requiring mitigation fee for those trees, it's although really I guess it depends site to site, but I would say 24.
I'm gonna say 24 as well, just because I think those examples were great to have. Thank you, because what I saw was that none of the options worked even at 24. And ultimately, that's going to make people just go straight to mitigation. And quite honestly, I'd love to see more of the trees saved and not just turn to mitigation. And so I think that if we do 20, even though we have the choice to mitigate or not, it will delay approval with people not in the crowd and the community not wanting mitigation, because I agree that's not as good of an example. And so I think it will delay the housing, and I think it will make people mitigate more than just saving trees.
Just commentary. I think we need to consider that it was the community that wanted us to preserve trees, so we just set that diameter of tree really high. People aren't going to end up seeing what I think they wanted to see.
Did the same thing that Pauline had done with 5 subdivisions that have already gone in. And I was just astonished at how few big trees there are. For example, excuse me, Skyline West, which is across the river, 332 significant trees, and that means healthy ones. They weeded out the ones that were not healthy. Only 14 were more than 20 inches. Sundown Development, 25 significant trees, 3 were more than 20 inches or more. Arena Acres, 92 significant trees, 36, which was good. Almost half were 20 inches or more. Lee Haven, 313 trees. That's a big development on Neff. Of 313, only 48 were 20 inches or more. And finally, Letterman Crossing, that's 15th and Reed Market, 100 significant trees, only 16 are 20 inches or more. So I'm going with 20 inches. And I'm surprised at what a small number there is. I guess this area was all logged at one time, or they missed a few. I mean, but there aren't very many 20 inches.
This
But
was a
let's
mill
play
town,
up.
Karen. They were harvested.
I'm honestly more torn than you might think. As I mentioned before, I love developers that can understand the plight that they have. I think when we start, making the threshold smaller, it is going to make it more difficult. Larger trees are going to be or need more space, and if you capture more of them. And another thing I just want to throw out there, and this is not really super relevant, but older trees don't recover as well, so they're harder to save. Younger trees bounce back, kind of like us, younger folks, they go out the next day, they feel a lot better than us older folks. I think just look at the numbers, I get a little blinded by it, kind of to Jeff's point, it seemed that a purple tree, or I guess more correctly, the blue and green tree, I couldn't really tell. What is the real benefit, I guess, is really what the question comes down to between a 20 and a 24-inch tree. And the most objective answer I can really think of is, and Christine might be able to answer this or quote it more, but is in the public commentary. One of the reports that was provided is a study. They were looking at basically what threshold trees provide kind of maximum or start to maximize their carbon sequestration rate. And I know that's a big goal of the city as well. And so if that, if we're trying to look at it as objectively as possible, it seems like 20 would be a good answer in terms of trees that we should start preserving because they do meet those goals that the city's laid out. And I think by capturing that, at least unfortunately, it's going to come down to probably the mitigation thing. But I think it's at least capturing that benefits is being taken away from the community. And so it's putting a real cost onto that. So I would have to go with 20.
I'm surprised no one brought up the difference between deciduous and coniferous in the measurement here. Kind of want to punt it back to Chris after I say that I'd like, for all the reasons said, but particularly Sarah's, that the community is asking us to preserve trees. And so I would go with the 20 inches, and I would I would actually even go with 18 inches for coniferous and 6 inches for deciduous. But if you want me to stick with just two options for the sake of making a decision, I'll agree with 20.
When, as we go through this is just identifying the size for preservation of priority trees.
Okay.
Doesn't mean we're not going to have a preservation requirement for those 6 inches or greater. So like the examples, those options includes both. So it gets at council's goal of preserving percent of large trees, and sometimes in some cases, that's enough canopy for preservation. But if it's not, then you would look at the smaller trees. So you'd start at the 6 inches or greater. And that gives a developer, in my opinion, some flexibility, because that way they can, save some of the smaller trees because they happen to be in the backyards or in the front yards. Or
So we're just sending a message. So actually, if it was, so we're just sending a message basically to developers, like, these are the trees that we care about.
a
So,
percent of them.
a percent of them, right?
We only
Right.
care
So if you
about a
actually.
percentage.
I have 5% of here. So I mean, then I wonder if actually smaller doesn't leave a little bit more flexibility, if it doesn't sort of open the prospective developers' eyes to.
There's two ways to look at the smaller one. If there's going to be more smaller ones, more 20 inches than there are 24 inches. And then depending on the preservation, you might have to preserve a little bit more because there's more of them. But that's just the game we're going to play, I think, when it comes to looking at the percentages that we come up with. But the 20 inches, then on the other hand, because there's more of them, gives the developer more flexibility on which ones to save, because you might have the 20 inches on the perimeter of the site and your 24 inches happen to be in the center. Will be much easier, I think, to save the ones on the perimeter than the one in the center. So I'm not voting, but I'd say 20.
Brett, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, please and thank you. I'm voting for 20 inches. I feel as if providing more flexibility in the future is going to be able to benefit not only the residents of Bend, but also provide developers with additional options. And again, flexibility. And I think the long-term benefits to having those flexible standards in place, I think will be a lot easy to revisit at the time when this committee or another committee similar to this reevaluates what we're doing here. So I am with 20 inches to provide more flexibility. Thank you.
I'm kind of falling in, what?
No, I want to hear what Jeff says.
I'm kind of falling into that neutral thought, similar to Eric, I think if we went with 20, I'd like to see different percentages. So that we're making sure that we're providing the right incentive. For creativity, developers are nothing if not creative. And I think the opportunity to. We've already lowered the diameter that has to be mapped, and then also potentially lowering the diameter for preservation. It increases the number of trees that are gonna get counted, which means there's more options, but it also, I wanna make sure that the percentages make sense, so that we don't have an unintended consequence of either preventing this housing from being added or accidentally allowing everything to be scorched earth. And I think we tend to think about this either as big developer or one-off. And, we're already lacking a certain amount of diversity in the development community to begin with. And the way you start is by doing a small job or a medium-sized job, right? And so if somebody gets together a piece of land that's an acre and goes to do something like this, and we've created a code that's extra hard. I'm not saying this is a barrier to it, but I'm hopeful that more people join the development community and that we can see more types of solutions. And that's where I'm thinking about, like, if we keep lowering these diameters, are we making it harder? So that, for me, it all comes down to the percentages more than the DBH that we pick here. Which will be, I look forward to that conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry, was it?
So did you decide on 20 or 24?
I think I'm voting with Kathy on.
If 20 gives more flexibility, I go that way, but I agree on the percentage. And there just has to be options, and I think because every lot is different, the developer has to be able to have a choice, I think, on how to do this.
And I had a thought, like, I wrote down that we can require, so that we're gonna lower the percentages of whatever DBH you're talking about for priority trees. And maybe you have a small percent that you do have to keep on site, like we saw both projects save too, that's better than none. And then whatever percent we come up with, the difference could have options for mitigation, but we maybe still can look at that with percentages. So 20 and 20?
Sure. Sure.
Under influence.
I don't think it made a difference.
Yeah.
Reading in 24.
It's tough.
Would have been a tie if you guys went 24.
Would not have that. I was actually a little bit worried right about here, where I was like, am I gonna be the deciding vote? Just because I went last. So our next discussion is gonna have to be around let's call it three options. For the preservation or the requirement, the preservation of priority trees, and then the percentage of total DBH when you can't preserve. And that's the part we need to think, like, if you're preserving 100% of the priority trees, is there a percentage that needs to be of other trees, or is it just zero as the minimum? But then when you can't preserve 100% of the priority trees, which is more likely, what's the right percentage? Is that sort of like where we're headed next?
I think so.
Okay.
And if there's options that you want me to look at,
The one thing I was gonna recommend, because I think this might be more helpful to you guys, is if we could figure out somehow the amount of area needed to preserve the trees, because really that's what it's gonna come down to. It's not just saving this diameter tree, but the roots involving the tree. So looking at the tree protection zones, because I think that's gonna have the greatest negative impact on the amount of spaces or buildable area, basically. And so I'm not sure if that's a method you could use, but I feel like that would be more useful to the development community in terms of what the actual impacts would be in percentages.
When you
that
set
make sense?
tree preservation fencing on a project, you set it at the drip line. For construction anyways. I was gonna ask, the total DBH, we're just summing up. The diameters, adding those together. Is that used somewhere else? What is that? What's the significance of that?
So if you go by the Portland's example option.
That's how they do it.
Yeah, so you do
Oh.
a percent of the number of priority trees, and then it's percent of the total DBH on site that you would preserve.
So it's just the sum of the diameters of everything that got mapped.
Yep.
Of all the inventory.
Yeah, and some of those big trees, when you take the sum of their diameter, meets the percent of the overall DBH that you might want to preserve on site.
Which reminder is now a lot more because it's everything six.
Everything's, yeah, so the denominator got bigger. Which is why we talked about the percentages going down. In some way to. Recognize that, I guess you can account for it, you can site by site balance that, yeah.
And back to Chris, I'll look at that. I think one part for staff to monitor. So in the code, it's easy to say this tree needs to be preserved. We don't have the capabilities to make sure that area around that tree is always preserved out in the field or after development.
Yeah, that's a different topic. That we
Yeah.
have to get into at some point is once certain trees are deemed to be preserved for that site, how do we ensure that they remain, or what happens if, it does need to be removed sometime down the line.
I looked at a couple of our cohorts. I picked Flagstaff, Missoula and Bozeman. Bozeman probably doesn't qualify. Flagstaff deals with that issue exactly, and they give it a 5-year window. So it's pretty interesting.
I will say that it is possible to use drill piers and grade beams and go somewhat underneath the canopy and still preserve the root zone if you have an arborist on site. I mean, it's more of a custom home approach than it is, a subdivision, but if you had like one lot that had this big tree and the only way to do it was to do it for one house, you could. So you don't want to totally prohibit building under the root zone if it's done reasonably.
He echoes that the design, flexibility in design, I think is another thing that's gonna help developers. Preserve more trees if that is the goal.
I think in Portland's code, even in their prescriptive tree protection, they allow disturbance in 25% of the root zone. So they just give some flexibility on.
Well, I think there's definitely flexibility. I mean, if you look, Eric was saying, it's the drip zone, which is completely correct, but sometimes if you have like a rock outcrop, there's
Right.
probably no roots in that root zone.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
and you can build that. So I
Yeah.
think, it's good to have these grand, kind of like what you're saying with mass production. It's good to have these great overarching things, but you still need some experts. And that's why I also think that having the city have an arborist on staff can look at some of these difficult questions and be able to work with developers.
And you can also, you could require, I've required, instead of using an excavator to dig trenches in the vicinity of a tree, you can tell them to use hand tools in those locations, because I've seen a lot of trees die because the excavator gets a hold of the roots and tears a whole bunch of things out. That tree's gonna die for sure, whereas it might have been saved if they dug that part of the trench with hand tools.
I was just gonna make a quick note, I think too, something you mentioned, Jess, was we did increase inventory, by reducing the trees that are being inventoried, but it kind of goes both ways, so not just seeing it as more trees have to be preserved, because many of the trees that already would have been preserved or have been preserved projects may not have been counted previously, but are being counted now. So that percentage is already factoring that into some degree,
Yeah,
just keeping that in mind.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just making sure that we understand the 3-dimensional chess. But don't forget, at the worst case, you could pay
But first, we want to make sure that these other options are totally viable and understandable by idiots like me who are at risk of trying to oversimplify. Okay, next meeting is scheduled. I don't have it memorized.
August 17th at 3 p.m.
17th, all right, so, thanks, everybody, this is really good work, and we will work on percentages next time with regard to these options, and then we can do replacement, followed by feeling.
And I
Adjourn.
Okay, you know, I was gonna ask a quick question, Pauline. Are the presentation slides sent before the meeting?